What kind of strength lets a gentle nun, empty-handed and ill, stand before violence and make it vanish tonight? Welcome, dear friends of St. Lives. Wherever you are listening now, perhaps beside a lamp or under a sky, thank you for joining me. Please subscribe and rest the story. We will follow Clare of Assisi from her bright childhood in nobility to her hidden life of radical poverty, through long sickness and hard resistance, until the night she lifted the Eucharist and an army fled, and her peace endured. And so, before she ever met Francis, the seed of holy restlessness was already alive in her. Clare was born in Assisi near the close of the 12th century, into a household where stone walls, good land, and an old family name promised safety in a world that often had none. Assisi rose above the Umbrian Valley like a ridge of pale stone, and beneath it fields of wheat and olive trees moved with the seasons. Life there was marked by bells, harvests, and the slow passing of pilgrims who crossed the roads to Rome or the shrines of saints. Her family belonged to the minor nobility, not royalty, but wealthy enough to live with servants, to host guests of rank, and to expect their children to marry within their class. Her father, Favaro, carried the pride of a knightly line. He loved his daughters and provided for them, yet he expected them to fit the shape of Assisi's noble life. A girl of his house was raised to become a wife who would strengthen alliances and secure inheritance. She would learn to manage a household, to receive visitors with grace, to keep family honor bright in a city where reputation was as carefully guarded as gold. Clare grew up inside this order, watching the rituals of feast days and formal visits, learning what was expected of her long before anyone asked her opinion. Yet her mother Ortolana carried another kind of inheritance. She was not devout as a fashion, nor did she use religion to decorate her family name. Her faith was practical, quiet, and sincere. People remembered her kindness to the poor, her pilgrimages to holy places, and her custom of turning household abundance into secret charity. In the evenings, she would tell Clare and her sisters stories of saints who loved Christ with daring simplicity, men and women who left security behind to follow a Lord who had nowhere to lay his head. From her, Clare learned prayers, but also learned a way of looking. A beggar was not a stain on the street, but a face of Christ. A sick neighbor was not a burden, but an invitation. God was not only found in incense and stone, but in the small corners where love is tested. As Clare grew, the world around her widened, and yet her heart moved in the opposite direction, toward what was hidden and poor. Outwardly, she was a noble daughter. She wore the clothing expected of her station and learned the gentle manners required in a household that hosted important visitors. She knew how to keep her eyes lowered, how to speak softly when spoken to, how to carry herself with the kind of modesty that was praised in young women. Those who saw her spoke of her beauty and reserve, and presumed that her future would be smooth and ordinary for her class. But inwardly she began to measure life by another scale. When she entered a church, what held her was not the glitter of candles or the carved marble, but the calm presence at the altar. She lingered in prayer longer than was necessary. She listened to the gospel as if it were addressed to her alone. The words about the poor, about leaving all to follow Christ, about treasures that rust cannot touch, slipped into her mind and would not leave. Assisi at that time was restless. Its proud spirit was matched by its divisions. Old noble lines jostled with rising merchant families, and conflicts with neighboring towns sometimes set the streets on edge. Men rode out to war, and women waited with rosaries. In the middle of that noise, the church stood as both refuge and authority. Bishops and abbots held real power, monasteries owned land, and pious gifts were often tangled with politics. Yet across Italy, new stirrings were rising, a longing for a cleaner gospel, one lived in simplicity rather than merely honored with words. Clare could feel that longing before she could name it. By her teenage years, she practiced disciplines that did not come from family custom, but from her own desire. She rose early to pray while the household slept. She fasted on certain days beyond what was asked of her, not to punish herself, but to keep her heart awake. She gave alms quietly, sometimes taking from her own portion so a hungry family could eat. She visited the sick when she could, and learned that tenderness is not weakness. These acts were small and easily missed, but they shaped her like water shaping stone. The more she turned toward Christ in the poor, the more the comforts around her seemed lighter, less necessary, almost like garments she had worn since childhood but no longer needed. Meanwhile, plans for her future moved forward as they did for any daughter of her rank. Suitors were considered. Conversations about alliances floated through the house with polite certainty. Marriage promised security, influence, children, a household of her own, and a respected place in the life of Assisi. Clare did not despise these goods. She understood that marriage could be holy, that family life could be a path to God. She saw couples in town who lived with gentleness and faith, and she admired them. Yet when she imagined herself in that life, something in her remained untouched, as if her heart were being called by a voice that would not fit inside those fine rooms. Such a question does not arrive with thunder. It comes like a shy guest, returning again and again until it is recognized. Clare began to sense the cost hidden inside her desire, and she trembled at it. She loved her family. She was grateful for their care. She could picture their grief and confusion if she chose a path they had never expected. At times, she wondered if she mistook youthful intensity for grace. Yet in prayer, the desire did not fade. It became steadier, clearer, like a spring rising through rock. In the quiet of evening, she sometimes looked out from her home at the town below. Lamps winked along narrow streets. Voices drifted from courtyards. Beyond the walls, the valley settled into darkness. Clare felt comfort because she lived among people who loved her. She also felt sorrow because she could not ignore the suffering pressed against Assisi's edges. The poor at church doors were not abstractions to her. They were faces she remembered and hands she had held. Their need felt like a wound in her own heart, and she sensed that God was inviting her not merely to help them from a safe distance, but to join them, to belong with them, to become poor with the poor Christ. For now she remained outwardly in her place, learning, serving, and quietly loosening her grip on what she had always known. She could not guess that another soul in Assisi was also being remade, that a young man named Francis would soon walk through the streets in rough cloth, singing of holy poverty with a joy that startled the city awake. She did not yet know that his witness would give language to her own longing, and that the hidden seed within her would finally break the earth. She only carried the hunger, and she waited. And in that waiting, God was already preparing the road ahead. Even in the warmth of privilege, Clare's soul had begun to listen for a different voice. The quiet seed now met a living flame. In the year when Clare's heart was already leaning toward God, Assisi began to hear a strange sound in its streets, not the clang of armor or the bargaining of merchants, but the laughter of a man who had given everything away. Francis, son of a cloth merchant, had once loved fine clothes and bright company, and people remembered him as one who delighted in the world's music. But something had broken open in him, and now he walked as a penitent, barefoot, wearing a simple tunic tied with rope, calling others to a gospel lived without possession. To many he looked foolish, to some he looked dangerous, a young man upsetting the order of things. Yet to the poor he looked like kin, and to the hungry-hearted he looked like a sign. He preached in the squares and at the doors of churches with words so plain that even children understood, and yet so burning that the well-fed grew uneasy. He spoke of a Christ who was poor by choice, who had loved those forgotten by the powerful, who had taken the cross not as a defeat, but as a wedding between heaven and earth. His voice carried through Assisi as wind carries the scent of rain. It came into homes like Clare's, where noble daughters sat behind lattice windows. It came into the mind of a girl who had been waiting for a voice she could trust. Clare heard about Francis before she saw him. People in her family spoke of him as a scandal, as a son who had humiliated his father by stripping in the cathedral square and renouncing inheritance. They shook their heads at the group of young men gathering around him, calling them dreamers who would soon be hungry and ashamed. But Clare listened past the judgment to the fact itself. There was a man in Assisi living the gospel as if it were truly real. When she finally saw Francis, perhaps from a distance at first, she noticed not only his poverty, but his joy. He was not grim, not sour, not doing penance with the face of defeat. He moved lightly, like someone freed from a burden nobody else knew they carried. The contrast startled her. She had known rich people who were restless, and poor people who were crushed. Here was a poor man who was radiant. It made her ask quietly, could this be what I have been seeking without knowing its name? Her mother's stories of saints now took on flesh. The words Clare had stored in her heart began to assemble themselves like a mosaic. She found reasons to attend Mass where Francis might speak. She listened carefully, not only to his sermons, but to the way he returned always to the same center. Christ in the humility of Bethlehem, Christ in the suffering of Calvary, Christ in the bread of the altar. He did not flatter his listeners, yet he did not scold. He invited them. He spoke as one who had fallen in love and could not hide it. Clare felt herself drawn toward that invitation, and still she hesitated. No one around her class lived like this. A noble daughter who left her family to become a poor penitent would not be praised as holy. She would be mourned as disobedient, perhaps even treated as dead. Clare knew those costs. She also knew that if she ignored the invitation, she might preserve peace in her household, but lose something in her soul that could never be recovered. Attention took root in her days. She went through the outward motions expected of her, yet inside she prayed for light and courage. Francis, too, was aware of the young women who listened from the edges of his gatherings. He was not seeking to form an order for them, at least not at first. His calling was to rebuild the church through a fraternity of poor brothers, proclaiming peace and repentance. But he knew that God often plants the same fire in different hearts, through friends, perhaps through her devout mother, or through the quiet network of women drawn to the new movement. Clare sent word that she longed to speak with him. Such a meeting had to be hidden. A noble girl meeting a man outside her family's control could stir suspicion, even if her purpose was holy. Yet the city was small, and the poor of Assisi were often invisible in the eyes of the powerful, which allowed messages and footsteps to pass unnoticed. When Clare met Francis in secret, likely in a church or a sheltered courtyard, she found no grand strategist, no polished leader. She found a brother in Christ who listened more than he spoke. Francis did not command. He asked. He did not promise ease. He spoke honestly of poverty, humility, and the cross. He understood the strength it would take for a young woman to surrender everything in the world she inhabited. He also perceived the depth of Clare's desire. There was nothing careless in her. She was not chasing romance or rebellion. She was answering a call that had already reshaped her inwardly for years. Francis encouraged her to trust the voice of Christ in her conscience, to let her life become a response of love. He pointed her not to himself, but to Jesus, the true bridegroom who asks for the whole heart. Clare left that meeting shaken and quiet, as if something had been sealed within her. Afterward, the discernment did not become easier. It became clearer. Clare returned to her home and saw everything with new eyes. The fabrics, the meals, the conversations about alliances, the gentle entertainments, all seemed fine in themselves, but they no longer felt like her future. She prayed in the night with a kind of steady urgency, asking God to prepare her family's hearts, to give her courage when the hour came, to protect her sisters who might be swept into scandal because of her choice. She fasted not to punish herself, but to sharpen her readiness. She learned from Francis's way that holiness is not a flight from the world in fear, but a movement toward Christ in freedom. Still, she did not rush. Clare's temperament was patient, deliberate. She did not want a sudden dramatic gesture that would fall apart under pressure. She wanted to know that what she was choosing came from grace, not mere emotion. Around her, Assisi was watching Francis with a mixture of fascination and irritation. Some priests admired his zeal. Others worried that such radical poverty threatened the church's stability. Town leaders feared the disorder of young people leaving trades and homes. Yet ordinary people felt hope. The poor had long been treated as necessary shadows to the city's wealth. Now Francis spoke of them as beloved, and more than that, as teachers of the gospel. In such a climate, Clare's calling was not appearing in a vacuum. She was stepping into a movement that was already stirring the conscience of the city. Still, for her personally, the stakes were high. She was a woman, and a noble woman, in a society that guarded women's paths closely. To become a poor sister would mean dependence on God rather than on family protection. It would mean hiding her beauty under a veil, exchanging silk for rough cloth, tables thick with food for bread earned by labor. It would mean the possibility of misunderstanding and the daily dying of pride. As months passed, Clare found herself increasingly unable to imagine doing anything else. The gospel words about leaving all and following Christ no longer felt like poetry. They felt like instructions spoken softly but firmly to her heart. The more she prayed, the more she sensed that God was not asking her to become less than herself, but more truly herself, a woman made for freedom in love. She began to prepare quietly. She set aside clothing and ornaments. She gave away small possessions under the cover of ordinary charity. She arranged, through Francis, a plan for the night she would leave, a night that would need to be swift and protected, because once she stepped beyond her father's house, the world would turn against her with urgency. By this point, her decision was no longer merely private. It had become a kind of interior consecration that awaited its outward seal. Clare did not yet know the exact hour, but she could sense it drawing near. Her heart was like a candle that has burned long enough to soften and reshape itself to the flame. She had listened. She had waited. She had tested the spirits within her prayer. Now she was ready to entrust her whole future to the same Christ who had already been guiding her unseen. She was still in her family's home, still a noble daughter in Assisi's eyes, but the world she was about to step into was already more real to her than the one around her. She had not left home yet, but in her heart the leaving had begun. What her heart had decided in secret, her feet now carried into the night. The days leading to Palm Sunday arrived with the soft turning of spring over Assisi, when the valley below began to green, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and olive bark. In the city, Palm Sunday was a feast of brightness, a procession that carried both joy and a kind of solemn anticipation toward Holy Week. Noble families prepared carefully, clothing their children in their best garments, gathering early to receive blessed palms at the cathedral. Clare moved through those outward preparations as she always had, quietly, gracefully, without causing alarm. Yet inside her, everything was sharpened. The time she had discerned with Francis had come. The plan was simple and dangerous. She would attend Mass with her family in the morning, receive the palm like the rest, then return home and wait until nightfall. When the household slept, she would slip out, leaving behind not only her bed and her childhood rooms, but the entire future that had been designed for her. The thought of it did not thrill her in a wild way. It steadied her, like a hand on her shoulder. She had prayed too long, wept too quietly, struggled too patiently for this to be a careless flight. Still, she was a human heart, and as the feast approached, she felt fear the way anyone feels fear when stepping into an unknown that cannot be undone. She feared for her mother's grief, for her father's anger, for her sister's shame. She feared the roughness of a life she had never lived. She feared, most of all, the possibility that she might falter halfway through, that her courage could break at the moment it was most needed. So she prayed with deeper simplicity than ever, asking not for signs or consolations, but for strength to do what she already knew was right. On the morning itself, she walked to the cathedral with her family among the press of people filling the streets. Assisi was awake and festive. Vendors called softly from stalls, children ran with palms clenched in their fists, neighbors greeted one another with the warmth of shared ritual. Inside the cathedral, the light was filtered, the air cool, the altar bright with candles. When the gospel was read, telling of Christ's entry into Jerusalem on a humble donkey, hailed as king by those who would soon scatter in fear, Clare listened as if the story were a mirror. The Lord entered his passion not by accident, but by choice, with love that did not bargain. She wanted to enter her own little passion in the same way, not dramatically, but faithfully. After Mass, she received her palm from the bishop, and there is a tradition that he placed it in her hands before any other girl of her rank. Whether that detail is exact or symbolic, it carries a tender truth. Clare was being singled out for a quiet procession of her own, one that would follow Christ more literally than anyone expected. She went home with the palm still green and fragrant, and the day passed in ordinary family rhythms. Meals were eaten, conversations drifted, the household settled toward evening. Clare's voice was calm. Her face betrayed nothing. She was not hiding in deceit. She was guarding a fragile peace until the last moment, like Mary holding a secret in her heart while life continued around her. As night arrived, the house grew still. Servants banked fires. Doors were latched. Footsteps faded. Clare waited in the darkness of her chamber, listening for the deep quiet that told her everyone was asleep. She had gathered only what was necessary, heart and body ready, her palm perhaps placed somewhere safe as a sign that she was leaving with blessing in her hands, even if no one knew it yet. When the moment came, she rose without ceremony. She did not light lamps or look back too long. She moved through corridors she had walked since childhood, passing rooms where her sisters slept, where her parents lay unaware of the fracture about to open in their lives. There was a small door in the house, sometimes called the death door, a door used to carry out the bodies of the dead so that the main entrance remained for the living. Tradition says that Clare chose this door to leave by, and whether or not that is historically precise, it is spiritually perfect. She was stepping out of one life as if it were already finished, and stepping into another as if she had already been reborn. The door yielded quietly. Cold air met her face. The city lay dark, stone streets silvered by moonlight. Her steps were soft but sure. Every shadow seemed alive with danger. She was a young woman alone at night in an unsettled town, and she knew that if she were stopped, the consequences could be harsh. Yet she also knew she was not truly alone. Somewhere in the night, Francis and his brothers were waiting, watching for her, praying for her safety. She walked quickly, her cloak drawn around her, her heart beating not with panic, but with that strange mixture of fear and peace that comes when love finally takes action. She reached the little chapel of the Portiuncula, the humble church Francis loved as a mother loves a cradle. Lamps glowed there in the night. The brothers were gathered with Francis among them, not as conspirators, but as witnesses to a vow. They welcomed her without noise, with the reverence one gives to a soul making a gift of herself. In that simple space, far smaller than the cathedral and far less ornate, Clare knelt. No music swelled, no crowd watched, the world did not applaud, yet heaven, she believed, was close. Francis spoke to her not as a master, but as a brother guiding a sister into the life she had chosen. He asked her to renounce the world, not because the world was evil, but because Christ was enough. Clare answered with the steadiness that had long been built in her prayer. Then, in a gesture both tender and severe, Francis cut her hair, removing the sign of noble femininity and placing on her the rough habit of a penitent. The sound of scissors in the quiet must have felt like a door shutting and opening at once. Hair fell to the floor like a little funeral. The veil settled on her head like a new dawn. In that moment, her leaving became irreversible. She belonged now to Christ in a visible way. She had no dowry to offer but her freedom. She had no weapon but her faith. She had no protection but the providence of God and the fraternity of those who lived in His name. Yet the night did not end with calm. News of her disappearance spread quickly at dawn. Her family was stunned, then furious. Noble houses did not lose daughters without a fight, and in a world where family honor was a living thing, Clare's departure was felt as a wound, even a betrayal. Men rode after her, calling her back, deciding whether to coax or force. Clare, meanwhile, had been brought to a Benedictine convent for safety, since the brothers could not shelter a woman in their own house without scandal. When her relatives entered the convent, they found her not trembling, but clinging to the altar. Some accounts say she held fast to it, showing her newly shorn head as vows made visible. Her family pleaded, threatened, tried to pull her away. Clare did not shout. She did not argue at length. She simply refused. The calmness of her refusal was perhaps more shocking than any rebellion. She was not acting from passion, but from conviction. In the end, they could not move her without violating the sanctuary itself. And so, defeated, they left her there. The noble daughter they had raised was no longer theirs to command. She had stepped into poverty like a bride stepping into her wedding, and she would not step back. Once the first storm passed, Clare was moved again to another convent, still under protection. But her heart was already settling into the truth of her new life. She had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The safety of her family home was gone. The future she would live was uncertain. Yet beneath all uncertainty she felt something clean and bright, a freedom that did not come from having options, but from having chosen love. She had fled in the night, yes, but not in fear. She had fled toward Christ. Once the veil touched her head, the old world could no longer claim her. After the leap into darkness, God answered with companions. The first days after Clare's flight were not the settled beginning of a peaceful convent life, but a tender and exposed season, like a small flame guarded against wind. She had crossed a threshold that could not be crossed back. Yet she was still a young woman newly severed from family protection and from the ordinary patterns that had shaped her since birth. For a time, she stayed among the Benedictine sisters at San Paolo and then at Sant'Angelo in Panzo, places of prayer and stability, where her relatives could not easily force her out without shame. The Benedictines did not live the same radical poverty that Francis embraced, and their monasteries held property to support their life, but they offered Clare a shelter while the storm around her settled. Within those walls, she tasted for the first time the rhythm of liturgy, not as a noble visitor, but as one of the vowed, rising in the darkness for the night office, praying psalms with women who had given their years to God. The simplicity of that life confirmed her choice, even if it was not yet the form she would finally live. Yet her family did not accept defeat quickly. In the weeks that followed, they watched, waited, and tried again. They sent messages, perhaps soft at first, then sharp, appealing to duty, to honor, to her youth, to the grief of her parents. Clare listened to all this with a sorrow that never turned into doubt. She loved them, and she knew the pain she had caused. But she also knew that to return would be to live a lie against the call she had prayed into clarity. When relatives appeared again, ready to press her home with stronger force, she met them not with bitterness, but with a steadfastness that could not be bent. If she seemed calm, it was because her decision had already been made completely inside her. She was no longer arguing with herself. The battle had moved outside, and the clarity within gave her a quiet courage. It was in this in-between season that the miracle of companionship began. Clare had fled without expecting followers. She did not imagine herself founding an order. She only knew that God had called her to belong to Christ in poverty and prayer. Yet her departure awakened something in those closest to her, especially in her younger sister Agnes. Agnes was still very young, perhaps 14 or 15, living under the same noble roof, bound by the same expectations, witnessing her sister's disappearance and the household's upheaval. To the family, Clare's flight was scandal. To Agnes, it was a luminous sign, as if someone had opened a window in a room she had not known was stifling her. She, too, had listened to Ortolana's stories and watched Clare's quiet devotion. She, too, had sensed the weight of a future chosen for her rather than by her, and now she saw that another future existed, one that demanded everything but promised a deeper belonging. Against all pressure, Agnes decided to follow. When she left home to join Clare, the family's anger flared again. They rode after her, and this time, because Agnes was younger and more easily seen as a runaway child, the relatives felt justified in using brute force. Accounts tell of men dragging her by the hair, beating her, trying to tear her from the convent. But Agnes clung to the altar as Clare had done, and something in the scene shifted. Whether through fear of sacrilege, through pity, or through the shock of seeing a second daughter choose the same path, they could not carry her away. Agnes remained. Her arrival did not merely comfort Clare. It confirmed that God was building something larger than a private vocation. He was gathering a family. Soon other women began to appear, some of noble birth like Clare, others from more modest homes, each drawn by the witness of Francis and by the strange bravery of a girl who had renounced everything without regret. They came quietly, not in crowds, but steadily, like drops that become a stream. Each arrival carried its own cost. Families grieved, argued, negotiated, and sometimes threatened. Yet the women persisted. What they were seeking was not escape, but meaning, not romantic rebellion, but a gospel lived fully. Francis, watching with astonishment and humility, recognized that the Spirit was forming a sisterhood in parallel with his brothers. He did not design it first. He received it. And because he knew scandal could easily rise if women lived too near the friars, he sought for them a place that was sheltered, but still close to the heart of his mission. That place was San Damiano, a small church just outside the walls of Assisi, already precious to Francis because it was there that he had heard Christ speak from the crucifix. "Rebuild my house." He had repaired its crumbling stones with his own hands, and the memory of that labor was a kind of pledge. San Damiano was humble, surrounded by olives and rough ground, more a hermitage than a convent. Yet to Clare it was a palace, not because of strength or beauty, but because it was where she could live the life she had chosen with sisters who shared the same hunger. When Clare and her growing little band moved to San Damiano, they were stepping into a new kind of exposure. The building was small. The walls were not thick against cold or heat. Their beds would be straw. Their food would be whatever charity and labor could provide. They would own nothing, not even the land beneath their feet. Their safety would depend on the goodwill of God and of people who might not always understand them. Yet they entered with a joy that did not require applause. Clare, though still young, was recognized as the mother among them, and she accepted leadership not as a triumph, but as a weight of love. She did not command in a worldly way. She served. She washed feet, cleaned floors, tended the sick, prayed for each sister by name. Her nobility became a kind of humility because she knew how to carry responsibility, and now she carried it for Christ alone. San Damiano began to breathe with the slow rhythm of contemplative life. The sisters rose in darkness to sing psalms, their voices thin at first, then more confident as the months passed. They worked with their hands, weaving, sewing, tending gardens, doing the humble tasks that kept poverty from becoming disorder. They ate simply, often little. They gave away what they could, even when they had little to give. They listened to the gospel daily, letting it shape their choices. Francis and his brothers visited to encourage them, bringing the sacraments, preaching peace, and protecting them from those who still sought to pull them back into the old world. Francis called them the poor ladies, not as a sentimental title, but as a description of their chosen identity. They were poor not because they were abandoned, but because they wanted to live without any cushion between their hearts and God. Poverty for them was not misery. It was a form of truth, stripping life down to what mattered most. Yet this beginning was not without its shadows. The memory of family conflict lingered. The physical hardship was real. Illness and fatigue visited them quickly in a building not designed for comfort. Clare herself began to learn that leadership in poverty means absorbing the anxieties of others while keeping one's own heart steady. At times, the sisters must have wondered whether they were strong enough for such a life, whether joy could last when the weather turned harsh, when hunger sharpened, when discouragement crept in with the night. Clare did not pretend these struggles were unreal. She met them with the same calm faith that had carried her through her flight. She reminded the sisters that their life was a response to love, and love does not fail those who trust him. She asked them to look at Christ poor on the cross, to see that his weakness was the door through which the world's salvation entered. If they felt weak, they were close to him. If they were unnoticed, they were sharing his hiddenness. If they were poor, they were finally free. In that way, the early community at San Damiano slowly became not a fragile experiment, but a rooted way of life. Its walls held prayer, but also laughter. Its poverty held hardship, but also astonishing peace. The city that had once been scandalized now began to look with wonder. Pilgrims came to ask for prayers. The poor came to receive bread and kindness. Even some of the powerful began to sense that something holy was unfolding there, something that did not threaten the church, but renewed it from within. Clare did not set out to protect a city or reshape an order. She only said yes to Christ when he called. Yet already, in these first fragile years, her yes was branching outward into a shelter for many hearts. San Damiano would remain small in space, but immense in grace. The girl who fled her house was now asked to build a home for others. San Damiano had never been meant to hold a movement. It was a small church with a few rough rooms, a boundary of olive trees, and an air of quiet that seemed made for hiding, not for founding something new. Yet grace often chooses small places precisely because human ambition is less likely to crowd them. As the months turned into years, Clare's community settled into a pattern that was at once simple and daring, and she found herself, almost without noticing the moment it began, carrying the title and responsibility of abbess. She had not sought leadership. It came to her like a cloak laid gently across her shoulders because the sisters trusted her steadiness, and because Francis, with his instinct for the Spirit's work, recognized in Clare a kind of motherhood that could hold a community in poverty without letting it unravel. The word abbess could suggest authority, even privilege, in other convents, but here it meant something closer to a servant of servants. Clare led by kneeling first, by eating last, by giving away what little comfort she might have claimed. If a sister was discouraged, Clare listened. If one was sick, Clare tended her. If tensions rose, Clare drew the community back to prayer, not as an escape, but as the source of their common life. She understood that a house built on poverty can crumble quickly if it is not held together by love. And so she poured herself into love, the kind that takes no account of its own cost. The poor ladies, as people now called them, learned the daily craft of living without possession. They did not own land, so they learned to depend on charity and on work that could be done within their enclosure. They wove linen for altars, embroidered simple vestments, baked bread, tended a garden when weather allowed. Their food was plain, sometimes painfully so, and there were seasons when it was scarcely enough. Their clothing was rough and mended. Their beds were low and hard. There were no secure revenues to guarantee tomorrow. This was not poverty enforced by misfortune. It was poverty embraced out of love for Christ. The sisters wanted to mirror his life, who was born in a borrowed shelter, preached without a purse, and died stripped of everything. To outside eyes, it could look harsh, even reckless. To Clare and her sisters, it felt like honesty. Wealth always brings a kind of weight, a subtle worry about keeping what you have. They wanted to live weightless in God's hands. In that choice, there was a sweetness that grew slowly, the way a fruit grows not in one day, but across many quiet ones. In their prayers, they began to taste a freedom deeper than comfort, a joy that did not depend on circumstance, because it rested on belonging to Christ alone. Francis visited when he could, bringing not only the sacraments through his brothers, but also counsel. He loved the sisters with a tenderness that was brotherly and reverent. He called Clare his little plant, and she called him her father, not in a childish way, but in the way one calls a teacher father when he has shown the road to God. Yet Clare was never a copy of Francis. The fire in her was distinct. Francis lived poverty as a wandering preacher, moving through fields and towns, singing and begging, meeting the world face to face. Clare lived poverty as hidden fidelity, staying planted in one place, turning poverty into a stable home for many women who could not travel as friars did. Their vocations were like two wings of one bird. Francis offered Clare a simple form of life, a kind of spiritual outline for the sisters, emphasizing the gospel as their rule, the love of poverty, and obedience within charity. Clare received it gratefully, but did not treat it as a finished structure. She understood that the sisters needed clarity about prayer, fasting, silence, and mutual service. So she shaped the daily life of San Damiano into something both contemplative and wholly evangelical. They did not cultivate an atmosphere of severity for its own sake. They cultivated a space where every sister could keep her heart close to Christ. Their enclosure was not a prison wall, but a garden wall. It protected a life meant to bloom quietly for the sake of the Church. As the community gained stability, Clare's own interior life deepened. She had chosen poverty outwardly, but she knew that the deeper poverty God desired was of the spirit, a heart emptied of pride, self-protection, and hidden control. In the tight quarters of San Damiano, there was nowhere to hide from one another, and so humility became daily work. Little irritations arose, personal habits clashed, memories of abandoned homes could ache unexpectedly. Clare met these human realities with the same patience she had shown toward her family's anger. She did not idealize her sisters as angels. She knew they were women like herself, bringing wounds, fears, and hopes into this life. When a sister struggled, Clare did not shame her. She reminded her gently why they had come: to follow Jesus poor and crucified, to live as brides of Christ, relying on his love. She used few words, but the ones she used carried weight because they were lived. There is a kind of authority that comes only from consistency. Clare wore that authority without noticing it, like someone who has become light enough to let grace shine through. The city around them slowly changed its gaze. At first, San Damiano had been a curiosity, a scandal even, the place where a noble girl had run away to live as a pauper. But time has a way of sorting scandal from sanctity. People began to see that this was not a reckless protest, but a steady life of prayer. Poor men and women came to the convent gate asking for bread or counsel, and the sisters gave what they could. Clergy came seeking prayers. Mothers came with sick children. Merchants, hardened by trade, sometimes left softened after a quiet conversation through the grill. The sisters had no visible power, no land, no political role, yet their hidden life began to thread itself into the spiritual bloodstream of Assisi. Clare did not seek influence. She would have recoiled from any attempt to turn San Damiano into a center of status. Yet the very refusal of status made their witness powerful. People felt, perhaps without fully understanding, that God was present in this small house because everything there pointed beyond itself. Still, the life remained fragile in worldly terms. The Church, while admiring Francis and his movement, also watched it with caution. The institutional memory of heresies and unregulated groups made bishops wary of any radical poverty that seemed to challenge established structures. Women's communities were especially expected to have stable resources, a dowry of land or income to prevent them from falling into destitution. Clare's sisters refused precisely that. They did not want property to secure them because they had chosen Christ as security. This refusal was beautiful, but it was also dangerous in the eyes of church administrators who carried responsibility for order. Already, hints of future struggle were gathering at the edge of their life. Clare could sense them. She was not naive. She knew that radical poverty, once lived by a few, might be tolerated, but once it spread, it would need to be defended. She did not fear that defense. She only asked God to keep her heart pure in the midst of it. For now, before those storms arrived in full, San Damiano continued its quiet apprenticeship in holiness. The sisters rose, prayed, worked, fasted, and loved one another. Clare's leadership grew more confident, but never more worldly. If anything, the deeper she went into her vocation, the more she became like a clear window, present, strong, but almost invisible in her own eyes, because what mattered was the light passing through. She had abandoned wealth in one night, But now she was abandoning herself day after day, the harder and holier work. Their poverty was not emptiness, but a space made wide for Christ. Love had brought her here, but now love demanded defense. The years at San Damiano were flowing into one another with a quiet steadiness. Yet under that still surface, the sisters were beginning to feel the slow pressure of a world that did not quite know what to do with them. Clare and her community were living something new in the church, not new in the gospel, but new in its outward form. Women had long lived vowed religious lives, but usually within monasteries, supported by land, dowries, and fixed income. Stability was considered a protection for women, and perhaps it often was. But Clare's sisters did not want protection that depended on property. They wanted the naked dependence of the poor Christ, to own nothing so that nothing could own them. Their poverty was not a decoration laid over a comfortable life. It was their very structure, the soil in which everything else grew: prayer, work, sisterhood, joy, and endurance. To outsiders it could look impractical, even irresponsible. To Clare, it felt like the only truthful response to the Lord who had called her. Yet because it was so radical, it drew attention from church authorities who believed they were safeguarding the sisters by urging them toward a safer path. One of the first to notice and care was Cardinal Ugolino of Ostia, a man of deep piety who would later become Pope Gregory IX. Ugolino admired Francis and wanted to help regularize the new movements springing up around him. He saw Clare's community as precious, but he also saw its vulnerability. Without property, how would they survive harsh winters, famine, or the fickleness of charity? Without a stable endowment, how could the church be sure the sisters would not become a burden on the people or forced into compromises that might weaken their devotion? His concerns were not cruel. They were the concerns of a guardian. So he offered Clare and her sisters a rule shaped partly by Benedictine tradition, with protections that assumed landholding as normal. Many women's houses welcomed such rules as a blessing, but Clare, who was gentle but not pliable, heard in this offer a quiet threat to the heart of their vocation. If they accepted property, even in the name of security, they would no longer be living as they had promised to live. Their trust would shift from providence to statutes. Their witness would soften. What had begun as a life of pure gospel poverty would become one more respectable convent among many, holy perhaps, but not the radical sign God had raised in Assisi through Francis, and her own. Yes. Clare did not respond with rebellion. She responded with the same patient courage that had carried her away from her family. She spoke respectfully to Ugolino, explaining that she and her sisters desired to follow Christ in absolute poverty, and that this was not mere stubbornness, but the core of their calling. Ugolino, understanding her zeal yet still worried, sought a path that would honor their desire while giving it an official shield. And so, through his mediation and Francis's plea, Pope Innocent III granted what came to be known as the privilege of poverty. This was no small thing. In a church where property meant stability, and stability meant safety, a pope was granting women the right to remain poor, to refuse all ownership, to live without a dowry. It was a privilege not because poverty is a prize, but because in that era to be left entirely without property required special papal protection. In a sense, the Church was saying, "We recognize this path as legitimate, and we will not force you to accept wealth against your will." Clare received the privilege like a precious relic, not to be admired in a cabinet, but to be defended as long as she lived. She knew how easily permissions can be withdrawn when leadership changes. She knew that tomorrow's caution might undo today's generosity. The privilege was a gift, but also a beginning of struggle. From that point onward, poverty was not only their way of life, It became their contested ground. Each new pope, each local bishop, each visiting cardinal could look at San Damiano and interpret it through a different lens. Some were moved by its purity. Others were unsettled by it. The sisters' refusal of property was a quiet critique, even if they did not intend it, of a church increasingly entangled in land and power. Clare never preached against the hierarchy. She loved the church as a daughter loves her mother, even when her mother is anxious. Yet she could not ignore what she had promised Christ. Her vow was not negotiable. To yield on poverty would be to yield on truth. And truth for her was not an idea, but a person who had claimed her whole life. In these early battles, Clare's strength began to show in a new way. People often imagine courage as something loud, a sword drawn, a voice raised. Clare's courage was like stone underwater, firm, silent, and impossible to sweep away. She wrote letters, received envoys, listened carefully, answered calmly. She was not clever in a political sense, but she was clear in a spiritual one. She knew why she had come here. She knew what had formed her sisters. She knew that their life had grown from Francis's embrace of the gospel, and that to alter it would be to sever its roots. She was also aware of her own frailty. She did not pretend to be a towering figure. She was a woman in a small convent, dependent on alms, with no levers of worldly influence. Yet she possessed something that authority recognized, even if it did not always like it, a conscience illuminated by prayer. That illumination made her unafraid. As time passed, other communities of women inspired by Francis began to appear in Italy. Some were closer to Clare's model. Some were more moderate. Church leaders naturally wanted a unified rule for them all. Uniformity is a kind of order, and order can be a kind of peace. But Clare feared that a unified rule would come at the cost of the radical poverty they had received as a unique gift. She would gladly have been united to other sisters in charity, but she could not accept unity bought by softening the gospel. The privilege of poverty thus became her shield. When pressures came, she lifted this papal protection gently but firmly. There is a scene remembered in tradition where Gregory IX, now Pope, tried to persuade Clare to accept some property for her sister's sake, and she answered him with a kind of luminous simplicity, telling him she wished to be absolved from sin, but not from following Christ's poverty. Whether the exact words are recorded perfectly or not, the heart of the exchange rings true. Clare was not defying the Pope out of pride. She was defying the temptation to safety out of love. The sisters, watching their abbess stand her ground without losing peace, learned from her that obedience is not blind yielding. True obedience listens for God first, then honors human authority within the boundaries of conscience and vow. Clare never wanted her sisters to despise those who urged caution. She understood that bishops and popes carried burdens she did not carry, but she also taught her sisters that vows are not ornaments placed on the soul. They are bonds of love. If love is broken for the sake of comfort, what remains? So poverty became for them a daily prayer and a daily defense. Each time they ate modestly, they were renewing a choice. Each time they refused an endowment or an inheritance, they were renewing a vow. Their emptiness was their testimony. Their dependence was their praise. Through these struggles, something else was quietly happening in Clare. It is one thing to renounce wealth once in a dramatic night. It is another to renounce security again and again over years, when the world insists that security is virtue. Clare learned that the deepest battlefield is not outside, but within. She had to surrender not only possessions, but the desire to control outcomes. She had to trust that if their poverty was truly of God, God would sustain it, even when church leaders did not yet understand. She had to become poor in spirit as much as poor in resources. This interior poverty was a harder grace because it meant living without guarantees, not even guarantees that one's own path would be approved. Yet it also refined her faith into something almost transparent. She was learning to stand in love without leaning on anything visible. To remain poor for Christ would require a courage few could see. The Sisters of San Damiano were not facing armies yet, not facing the kind of dramatic danger history would later remember. But they were facing the slow, grinding pressure of compromise, the subtle argument that says, be sensible, be safe, be like everyone else. Clare knew that arguments like this can erode a vocation more surely than persecution, because they come disguised as care. Her task, then, was to protect the fire God had lit, not by shouting, but by keeping it fed with prayer and defended with clarity. In doing so, she was shaping not only her convent, but the future of Francis's movement, and, in time, the conscience of the Church itself. She fought without weapons, because truth doesn't need armor. As her order grew stronger, her body grew smaller. The same years that brought the privilege of poverty and the slow widening of San Damiano's influence also carried Clare into a landscape she had not chosen, but would come to love with the fierce trust of a saint, the landscape of illness. It did not arrive as a single catastrophe. It came like a tide, creeping in gradually until her strength was no longer her own. In the early years of her vocation, Clare had labored like any sister, fasting with zeal, keeping long vigils, tending the sick, sweeping floors, kneading bread, and carrying the ordinary burdens of a small, poor household. Her youth and noble upbringing had not prepared her for physical hardship. Yet she embraced it with a kind of bright generosity. She wanted to share the poverty of Christ without reserving a comfortable corner for herself. But bodies are honest teachers, and hers began to teach her the limits of zeal. The fasts that had once sharpened her prayer now weakened her. The cold of stone rooms seeped into her bones. The long nights of vigil left her exhausted. By her early 30s, perhaps earlier, she began to suffer illnesses that never fully left her, fevers that returned, weakness that lingered, pain that made even small movements costly. The exact medical cause remains unknown to us, but the spiritual shape of it is clear. Clare was being asked to live the gospel not only through renunciation, but through endurance. At first, the sisters must have been unsettled. Their abbess was the one who steadied them with gentle strength, the one who seemed to carry the community in her calm eyes and quiet smile. When she grew frail, it could have felt like a threat to their fragile way of life. Yet Clare did not treat her illness as a tragedy that removed her from her vocation. She treated it as another door into the same love. She had chosen poverty. Now poverty was choosing her, a poverty of health, of energy, of outward usefulness. It is one thing to say, "I will be poor," when you are strong enough to work and to decide how your day will go. It is another to be poor in the deeper sense of having no control over your own body, waiting on others to lift you from bed, to bring you water, to pray beside you when fatigue makes even prayer hard. Clare allowed herself to be carried into this new humility without bitterness. She did not romanticize her suffering. She knew it was hard. There were nights when pain pressed like a weight on her ribs, and the breath itself felt like labor. There were mornings when she looked at the work of the sisters and longed to rise and help them, but her limbs would not obey. There were seasons of discouragement when the thought must have whispered, "Are you still useful to God like this?" Yet she did not obey that whisper. She answered it with a quieter truth. "My life is not measured by usefulness. It is measured by love." Her cell became a kind of second cloister, a hidden convent inside the convent. From her bed, she could still hear the sisters singing the offices, their psalms swelling and receding like the tide of prayer. Sometimes she joined when she could, her voice thinner now, but perhaps more rooted. Sometimes she listened in silence, offering her attention as prayer when words were too heavy. The sisters would come to her, not only to care for her body but to seek her counsel, because illness had not diminished her clarity. If anything, it had refined it. Pain makes some people turn inward in despair. In Clare, it seemed to turn her inward toward Christ. She spoke less now, not because she had less to give, but because she had learned that words are precious and should be fitted to the moment. When she did speak, her sisters remembered. She could lift a discouraged heart with a sentence, because behind the sentence stood years of lived truth. Illness also shaped the way she led. Clare could no longer govern by doing everything herself, by being the first to work and the last to rest. She had to govern by trust. She delegated tasks to sisters who were strong, and when their decisions were imperfect, she corrected gently, remembering her own frailty. She became more like a mother who guides from the heart rather than a worker who guides from the hands. This was not easy for someone as naturally responsible as Clare. To accept dependence is often harder than to accept hardship. Yet she accepted it, because dependence was the very language of the gospel she had chosen. Christ had depended on Mary's milk, on Joseph's protection, on friends who gave him shelter, on women who followed him to the cross, on hands that wrapped his body after death. If the Lord had taken dependence into his own life, how could she reject it in hers? So Clare learned to receive care without shame. She allowed sisters to wash her, to adjust her bedding, to feed her spoonful by spoonful when her strength failed. She received this not as humiliation, but as mutual charity. The sisters, in caring for her, were living their vocation too. There were also moments of quiet radiance within the suffering. Tradition remembers that Clare's joy did not vanish with her health. Sometimes, even when her body was weakest, her face carried a light that startled those who entered her cell. The sisters complained less around her, as if her endurance shamed their impatience without her ever intending it. Visitors felt peace in her presence. It was not the peace of someone who had escaped pain. It was the peace of someone who had handed pain over to Christ and found that he did not waste it. Clare's illness became a kind of prayer without words, a constant offering. She would speak of suffering as a mirror in which one sees the crucified Lord, and in seeing him there, one finds not only meaning, but companionship. She was not alone in her bed. Jesus was there, not hovering above like a distant judge, but lying beside her in the same poverty of flesh. This long sickness also prepared her for what was coming. San Damiano's trials with church authorities and later with invading soldiers required a leadership that could stand firm, even when the body was not strong. Clare was being taught that courage doesn't flow from muscle. It flows from union with God. By the time dramatic dangers arrived, she had already faced a daily danger more intimate, the temptation to despair in weakness. She had already learned to stand without standing, to fight without force, to lead without moving. There is a strange paradox at the heart of Christian holiness. When a person loses what seems to make her effective, she can become more fruitful than ever. Clare's cell was a place of fruitfulness. From it, prayer rose like incense, counsel flowed, the sisters felt anchored. Her weakness, offered in love, became part of the foundation of their order. Still, she remained fully human. There were days when she missed her childhood sister's laughter, days when she remembered her mother's face, days when she felt the ache of being enclosed, ill and dependent year after year. She did not crush these feelings. She carried them into prayer the way one carries a candle into a dark church, trusting that God sees what is hidden. She did not demand that suffering be sweet. She only demanded that it be given. And because she gave it, God turned it into something luminous. Her cell became a battlefield where holiness was quietly won. In the low, dim room at San Damiano, where straw and stone and pain were her companions, Clare learned a deeper poverty than she had known in her flight from home. She learned to renounce the illusion of control, to accept the slow stripping of strength, to love her sisters even when she could not serve them as she once had. She learned to let Christ be enough in weakness as he had been enough in renunciation. And in that hidden victory, she was being shaped for the next chapter of her pilgrimage, when grief and responsibility would meet her in the person of Francis himself. The father of her path was fading, and the daughter had to stand. By the time Clare's sickness had settled into the bones of her daily life, Francis too was moving into his own long valley of weakness, and the friendship between them was being tested in a new way, not by distance or misunderstanding, but by the slow approach of loss. Francis had always been a man of restless roads, of villages crossed with bare feet, of sermons scattered like seed along Italy's hills. His body had carried him gladly in the beginning, light and radiant with the first joy of conversion. But years of fasting, cold nights, travel, and the interior burning of his vocation had left him worn. His eyes grew damaged, likely from illness and the brightness of sun on stone roads. Fevers visited him. The marks of the Lord's passion, the stigmata, had pressed themselves into his flesh on Mount Laverna, a mystery that increased his suffering even as it sealed his union with Christ. He began, more and more, to need rest in ways that his spirit found hard to accept. And in the delicate logic of God, when Francis needed quiet shelter, the place his path returned to was San Damiano, the humble convent where Clare and her sisters were already living his gospel in another key. There is something tender and almost hidden about those final meetings between Francis and Clare. History remembers Francis as a public saint, a troubadour of Christ, and Clare as the cloistered mirror of his poverty. Yet their bond was not built on admiration at a distance. It was built in the ordinary texture of shared faith, counsel, and trust through years. Clare had never treated Francis as a celebrity or an ornament to her story. She treated him as the brother through whom God had confirmed her vocation. Francis, likewise, did not treat Clare as a disciple of lower rank. He saw in her a living proof that the Spirit's call to poverty was not a masculine adventure alone, but a gift for the whole church. Now, as illness pressed on them both, their friendship became less about plans for the future and more about fidelity in the present. Francis arrived at San Damiano tired and half-blind, and the sisters received him not as a guest to be honored with ceremony, but as a brother to be cared for in love. Clare, though confined often to her bed, insisted on serving him as she could, sending sisters to bring water, to prepare the simplest food, to offer the quiet comfort of presence. In those tasks there was no sentimentality, only that clear charity which looks at a suffering person and sees Christ suffering there. Francis stayed in a small hut or room near the convent, close enough that he could hear the sisters' prayer and feel their protection, but still within the boundaries of propriety. The days were slow. Sometimes he spoke to Clare. Sometimes he sat in silence that was itself a kind of prayer. He had always loved the crucified Lord, but now he was learning to love him even more as his body ceased to obey his will. Clare, seasoned by her own long weakness, understood what kind of humility this required. She did not offer him empty consolations. She offered companionship. There is a particular mercy that one suffering soul can give another, the mercy of not explaining away pain, of not fearing it, of not needing to fix it. Clare gave Francis that mercy. In her presence he could be frail without shame. In his presence she could be grateful without nostalgia. They were two branches of one tree bending toward the same sun. In those years, Francis also composed for Clare and her sisters a kind of spiritual farewell, encouraging them to persevere in their poverty, to love one another, to keep their eyes fixed on Christ. If he could no longer protect them with his physical presence, he wanted to protect them with words. Clare received these words like a last inheritance, a testament heavier than gold. She knew that once Francis was gone, the pressures on her convent would likely increase. His living authority, his warmth with popes and bishops, his reputation for holiness had acted as a shield around San Damiano even when he was absent. Clare had leaned on that shield not to avoid responsibility, but because she knew God often uses one saint to defend another. Now she could sense her own task widening. She did not feel ready in a human sense. She was sick, enclosed, without worldly training. But grace had already taught her that readiness comes not from strength, but from surrender. When Francis finally approached death, he asked to be carried back to the Portiuncula, to the place where he had first heard his vocation clarified, and where his fraternity had begun. He wanted to die in the poverty he had chosen, on bare earth, under the gaze of the Mother of God. The news of his worsening reached San Damiano like a darkening sky. Clare could not simply rise and go to him. Her illness and her enclosure made that impossible. She watched from a distance, and the distance itself was a cross. One of the deepest griefs in life is to know someone you love is dying and not be able to sit beside them. Clare carried that grief as she carried everything, in prayer. She sent sisters with messages of love and gratitude. She asked them to bring back word of his peace. She united her suffering to his, not as a dramatic gesture, but as an interior offering. When Francis died on October 3rd, 1226, Assisi's bells did not just mark an event. They marked the passing of a spiritual spring whose waters had already reached far beyond the town. Clare heard, and the grief must have struck her like a physical blow. For a time she was silent, letting the loss move through her as one lets a storm pass through the body. She did not weep in a way that sought attention. Yet the sisters knew she was wounded. Francis had been more than a friend. He had been the visible sign of the path God had given her, the living confirmation that her poverty was not madness but gospel. His death could have felt like the earth shifting under her feet. Yet another grace was at work. The friendship of saints does not end in death. It becomes a task. Clare's grief did not turn her backward into despair. It turned her forward into fidelity. She could not keep Francis alive by holding on to memory. She could honor him only by living the vocation he had helped awaken. There is a way of grieving that clings, and a way of grieving that releases. Clare chose the second, not because she loved less, but because she loved more. She knew Francis belonged to God, and she knew his mission now rested, in part, in her hands, and in the hands of all the brothers and sisters he had formed. She encouraged her community to pray for him, to be grateful, to let his life deepen their own resolve. In the quiet of her cell, she spoke to the Sisters of Hope, reminding them that Christ is the true founder, and he does not die. Francis had been a torch that lit their path. Now that torch was in heaven, but its fire remained on earth in their poverty, their prayer, their love. The years immediately after Francis's death also brought practical changes. The order of the Friars Minor was growing rapidly, spreading to other regions, receiving more formal structures. Leadership passed into other hands. Some brothers remained fiercely loyal to Francis's radical poverty, while others feared the movement would collapse without stability. These internal tensions among the friars echoed and sometimes intensified the pressures Clare already faced. She knew that without Francis's personal protection, San Damiano might soon be urged again to accept property, to soften the edges of its vocation. The grief in her heart sharpened her vigilance. She did not become suspicious or hard. She became clearer. The loss of her friend was like the removal of a support beam that forces a house to learn its own strength. Clare learned hers, not by becoming louder, but by rooting herself more deeply in Christ. In those seasons of mourning and transition, Clare also discovered something gentle and surprising, that love purified by loss becomes freer. She still cherished Francis, but now she could love him without needing him. She could thank God for him without leaning on his presence. She could understand the vocation he had given her as something that did not depend on his living voice. This was a mature holiness, one that makes room for God's work beyond the human instruments he uses. Clare's faith had never been in Francis. It had always been in Jesus. Francis had pointed to Jesus, and now, even in death, he continued to do so. She had not left home yet, but in her heart, the leaving had begun. The return line for her earlier flight once said. Now that leaving was complete in another sense. She had left behind even the comfort of Francis's nearness. She was standing more alone, not in loneliness, but in responsibility. The daughter of his path had to stand not because she was strong, but because grace had taught her to stand in weakness. The friendship of saints had become an inheritance, and the inheritance was now a mission. The friendship of saints does not end in death. It becomes a task. The danger now came not from outside walls, but from within the Church's caution. After Francis's death, the little house at San Damiano did not change its rhythm outwardly. The sisters still rose before dawn, still sang the psalms in the dim chapel, still worked with their hands, still fasted, still received whatever alms God provided. But inwardly, the air had shifted. A protection had been lifted, and those who had once hesitated to press Clare now felt freer to insist. Francis, alive, had been a living argument for the gospel poverty she loved. His holiness stood like a bright banner that made even cautious men reluctant to tamper with what he had blessed. With him gone, the banner remained, but people began to interpret it in ways that suited their fears. The Church in those decades was anxious to bring the growing Franciscan movement into stable unity, to protect it from fragmentation, and to guard it against the suspicion of heresy. These were real concerns, not imaginary. Movements can burn out or break apart if they are not guided. Yet the very effort to stabilize could also smooth away the sharp edge of the gospel that had made the movement holy in the first place. Clare could see that. She had no desire to create division, but she refused to let the fear of division become an excuse for compromise. Cardinal Ugolino, now Pope Gregory IX, loved Clare and respected her vocation, yet he also carried the weight of governing the Church. He knew how fragile women's communities could be without resources. He watched new houses of poor ladies spring up in Italy, some living poverty with fervor, others already wavering. He worried about scandal, about hunger, about the possibility that a future abbess might not carry Clare's clarity, and that the sisters could fall into chaos. So he tried again to persuade her to accept some property or stable income. It was not an order at first, more a paternal urging, the kind that sounds reasonable when one hears it with worldly ears. Clare listened, and in her listening there was no contempt. She knew Gregory's heart. She knew he wanted to protect her. She also knew that protection can sometimes become a subtle chain. If they accepted property, Even in a small measure, the door would open wider later. Absolute poverty can be lost not in one dramatic betrayal, but in a series of sensible concessions. Clare had watched this pattern in the world she left behind. She would not let it happen to her sisters. So she answered with a calm firmness that astonished even popes. Her reply was not lengthy, not argumentative. It was almost childlike in its purity. She said, in effect, that she desired to be absolved of sins, not of poverty. "You can take away my faults," she implied, "but do not take away my imitation of Christ." Gregory, who could command armies in the name of Christ, found himself unable to command this frail abbess to abandon her vow. There are moments in history when authority meets sanctity and recognizes a boundary it cannot cross. This was one of those moments. Gregory did not withdraw his concern, but he did not force her. The privilege of poverty she had obtained from Innocent III still stood, and she held it like a shield of paper stronger than steel because it was rooted in conscience. Yet the pressure did not vanish. Other officials visited, bringing proposals, revised rules, gentle warnings. There was also the question of chaplains. Francis had wanted the brothers to serve the sisters spiritually, ensuring they remained close to the original charism. Some church leaders feared that too much reliance on the friars would compromise female enclosure or create scandal. They attempted at times to separate the sisters from the brothers' guidance. Clare resisted this separation too, not because she wanted gain or control, but because she knew her community had been formed through Francis's spirit, and the brothers were part of their family. To sever that bond would be to make them vulnerable to a different spirit, one less radical in poverty. She wanted obedience to the church, yes, but not obedience that uprooted the very grace that had created them. At the same time, Clare was not stubborn for stubbornness' sake. She examined her own heart repeatedly. The temptation for anyone who resists authority is to enjoy resisting it. Clare did not enjoy it. She suffered through it. She prayed to remain humble, to remain docile to God even as she stood firm before men. She asked herself in silence, "Are we resisting because we want to be right, or because Christ has asked this of us?" And each time, the answer returned like a steady bell in her conscience. We are resisting because we vowed it, and because we believe Christ has called us to it. Her resistance was thus not rebellion, but fidelity. It carried the subtle agony of loving the church while disagreeing with some of her leaders' prudence. Clare did not see church authorities as enemies. She saw them as anxious brothers who did not yet trust fully the gift Christ had given. She resisted them the way a daughter resists a mother who wants to protect her with too heavy a blanket. She resisted out of love, not out of contempt. These battles were complicated further by the shifting landscape among the friars themselves. After Francis's death, the brothers were divided in practice, if not in name, between those who wanted to preserve strict poverty and those who believed some mitigations were necessary for missionary work and growth. Clare watched these tensions with sorrow, because she knew that if the brothers softened, pressure on the sisters would grow. Yet she did not intervene in their debates with any authority. She simply lived their original gospel as clearly as she could, trusting that example speaks even when words are not permitted. In a sense, San Damiano became a memory of Francis still alive, a living reminder that radical poverty had once been the movement's heart. Clare did not intend to be a symbol. She was simply being faithful. But fidelity itself becomes a symbol when the world is tempted to forget. Within the convent, the sisters sometimes felt the strain. When emissaries arrived, when rumors spread about new rules, when the possibility of property was raised again, some younger sisters may have wondered whether their poverty was truly sustainable. Clare knew this. She gathered them when she could, from her sickbed if necessary, and spoke with a gentleness that did not deny reality. She told them that their poverty was a gift entrusted to them. It was not theirs to discard lightly. It was their path to Christ, and therefore their path to peace. She reminded them that if they were hungry, Christ was hungry with them. If they were insecure, Christ had lived without security. If they were misunderstood, Christ had been misunderstood. She did not cut off their fears. She baptized them in hope. And because she herself lived what she said, fear in the community did not harden into doubt. It is striking to imagine Clare in those years, a woman often too weak to stand, yet standing before the strongest men on earth, a woman enclosed behind a wall, yet shaping the Church's future, a woman with no dowry, no political allies, no weapons, yet refusing to surrender the very thing popes and bishops wanted to give her for her own safety. The world might call this obstinacy. The Church would later call it sanctity, because the line between stubbornness and holiness is not in the outward act, but in the inward love that drives it. Clare's love was pure. She chose poverty not because she despised wealth, but because she adored the poor Christ. If some leaders could not understand that, she would wait them out with patience, the way rock waits out the river. Time, she knew, belongs to God. And while these quiet battles unfolded, another kind of danger was moving in the wider world, one that would soon bring the sound of hooves and weapons to the very gate of San Damiano. Clare did not know the hour, but she could sense that her sister's life wasn't meant to remain sheltered from history. The gospel they lived would be tested not only in letters and permissions, but in a night of terror and faith. For now she continued to fight without weapons, because truth does not need armor, and her little convent held its breath, waiting for what God would ask next. She fought without weapons, because truth does not need armor. Years of hidden fidelity were about to meet a visible test. The world beyond the olive trees of San Damiano had not been quiet while Clare suffered and argued for poverty. Italy in those decades was a patchwork of rival cities, papal territories, and imperial ambitions, a land where alliances shifted like weather, and soldiers could appear on a road with little warning. The papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor were locked in bitter conflict, each claiming rightful authority over regions and peoples, each drawing allies and mercenaries into their struggle. Assisi, small but proud, found itself in the orbit of these tensions. Armies were not distant stories to the people of the Umbrian Valley. They were a recurring shadow. Fields could be trampled, towns burned, women taken, churches looted, and the poor left with nothing but ashes. Even those behind convent walls were not immune, because war respects no enclosure when hunger and greed are loose. Clare knew this in an abstract way long before she faced it in the flesh. She had left the world of nobles who planned defense and tribute. She had entered the world of poor women who had nothing to offer invaders except prayer. Yet prayer, she believed, was not nothing. It was the deepest defense, even if the world laughed at it. San Damiano had always been vulnerable. Its position outside the city walls made it both peaceful and exposed. From the convent one could see Assisi rising above, a crown of stone against the sky. One could also see the open slopes below, the paths by which travelers, and, if God permitted, enemies might approach. The sisters lived with no weapons, no guards, no treasures hidden in cellars. Their poverty meant there was little to steal, but marauders do not need riches to do harm. Women themselves can become spoils. The sisters understood this danger the way country people understand storms, not by reading about them but by remembering old scars. They prayed for protection, not with panic, but with the steady trust of those who had long learned to live without earthly guarantees. Clare, bedridden most days, carried this fear for them more sharply than any. A leader who cannot run feels danger sooner because she knows her sisters will look to her for courage when her own body is helpless. She did not let that knowledge turn into anxiety. She lifted it to God, telling him again and again in the dark watches of night, "This house is yours. These daughters are yours. I have no power but you." Then the warning came. The year was 1240, or very near it, when rumors reached Assisi that bands of Saracen mercenaries, soldiers employed by the Emperor Frederick II, had moved through Umbria. These men were feared not only for their skill at war, but for their reputation of cruelty, sharpened by religious and political hatred. They had already attacked towns, stripped churches, and terrified villagers. Their presence near Assisi was like a spark near dry grain. In the city, people hurried to reinforce walls, to hide valuables, to prepare for siege. At San Damiano, the sisters could do none of these things. Their defenses were lilies and psalms. Still, they were not naive. When the first scouts were seen on the roads below, when horsemen's silhouettes appeared against the lower hills, dread flooded the convent. Some sisters wept. Some ran to close doors that were never meant to hold back armed men. Some fell to their knees in prayer with the kind of prayer that trembles. Claire heard the commotion from her cell. She knew at once what it meant. The danger she had feared in the abstract was now standing at their gate. The soldiers came quickly, a dark swell of men and horses, their armor clattering in the narrow paths, their voices like a rough wind. They were not merely passing, they had intent. San Damiano was an easy target outside the walls, filled with women, unprotected. They climbed over the convent enclosure, perhaps using ladders, perhaps simply breaking through. The sisters, seeing them, felt terror sharpen into a cold helplessness. What can a poor nun do when armed men enter her courtyard? Flight was impossible. Resistance was unthinkable. The only refuge left was the chapel, and so they gathered there, some pressing against the walls, some crouched on the floor, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles went white. Their eyes turned to Claire. She was their abbess, their mother, and the one whose faith had steadied them through every long dispute. But now she was sick, too weak to stand, to walk, to lift a hand. What could she do for them now? The moment was poised on the edge of despair, and the enemy was already inside the convent. Claire asked to be brought to the chapel. The sisters hesitated. To move her, to expose her frail body to cold air and shock, felt dangerous in itself. Yet her voice held that calm resolve they knew too well to resist. They placed her on a litter or carried her in their arms, and as they moved through the convent corridors, the sounds of soldiers pressing nearer followed like a storm following a leaf. They set her down near the altar. Claire's face was pale. Her body was thin with long illness. Yet in her eyes there was no panic. She looked not at the soldiers first, but at the tabernacle, the place where the Eucharistic Lord rested, the heart of their life. This was the center that had shaped everything for her: poverty, endurance, resistance, friendship, and now, she believed, defense. The sisters waited, breath caught, as if the whole house had become a single listening ear. Claire asked for the Blessed Sacrament to be brought to her. Whether in a monstrance, shining, or in a simple ciborium veiled in cloth, the Eucharist was carried with trembling reverence from its place. The priest or chaplain who held it must have felt the weight of history in his hands. The sisters watched as if watching the sun being lifted from a hidden room into night air. Outside, the soldiers pressed closer. Some were already at windows, calling out, jeering, testing the doors. Their confidence was the confidence of men who have never been refused what they want. Claire, carried into the chapel like a dying woman, seemed no threat to them. Yet she did not act like a dying woman. She took the Eucharist in her hands and held it close. For a moment she prayed silently, not with elaborate words, but with the directness of a child speaking to the Father. She asked Christ to protect his handmaids, to defend his house, to spare Assisi. The sisters later would say that her voice was steady, and that what steadied it was not human boldness, but a kind of trust so complete it left no room for fear. She then had herself carried to the doorway or window that faced the invading men. Her body was so frail that she could not rise by herself, yet she insisted on being placed where she could meet the danger head-on. The sisters, still trembling, obeyed. They did not understand how this would help, but they had learned that Clare's obedience to God often led where reason could not see. There she was, a small sick woman in a simple habit, holding the Eucharist, the bread of heaven, toward men armed with spears and swords. The contrast was almost unbearable. It was as if weakness were challenging power and silence rebuking violence. Clare did not shout a command. She did not curse them. She simply lifted the Lord she loved. In her heart, she knew that if Christ is truly present in the Eucharist, then he is not a symbol, but a king, and no earthly army can stand where he forbids. This was not a magic gesture. It was an act of faith, the kind that risks everything on the truth of God. The soldiers saw her. They saw the sacred vessel. Some accounts say a sudden fear seized them, not the ordinary fear of battle, but a deeper disorientation, as if they were confronted by something they could not interpret. Others say a brilliant light shone, or a voice was heard from the sacrament, promising protection. The exact outward form of the miracle is veiled in time. What is not veiled is the result. The invaders recoiled. Their confidence crumbled. They fled from the convent as if chased, retreating down the slopes, leaving San Damiano untouched and Assisi spared from immediate devastation. But at this point in the story, we have not yet entered that miracle fully. We are still standing in the doorway with Clare, the Eucharist raised, the enemy before her, and heaven leaning close. The sisters, watching their abbess meet violence with faith, began to feel their terror loosen into a trembling hope. They did not yet know how God would act, only that Clare had brought them to the only defense that cannot be broken. The danger had come to their gate. Yet in the quiet of the cloister, history held its breath. What happened next was not noise, but a sudden holy reversal. The courtyard of San Damiano had filled with the coarse breath of men who believed they were masters of whatever lay before them, and the sisters, gathered behind Clare, felt the raw nearness of danger like heat on the skin. Yet in that doorway, where a sick abbess was held upright by the arms of her daughters, another presence was standing. Clare lifted the Eucharist higher, not as a threat, not as a charm, but as an offering of trust. Everything she had lived for years led into this instant. The vow of poverty that stripped away every other security, the long illness that taught her to lean only on God, the battles with authority that trained her in patient fearlessness, the grief for Francis that purified her love into something undivided. In her hands was the host, humble as bread and radiant as God, and she believed with a clarity deeper than sight that the Lord who had made himself small for love could also make himself terrible to evil for the sake of his children. The soldiers saw the small white sign of the sacrament, but they did not see what she saw. They saw a woman too weak to walk. She saw the King of Heaven. She did not speak many words. There is a tradition that she prayed aloud, asking Christ who had sheltered her all her life to shelter her sisters now. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the honesty of a heart that had no other argument left but faith itself. Around her the sisters were silent, some weeping, some frozen, all watching. Then the mood of the invaders shifted as quickly as wind shifts across a field. Courage that is only animal courage can collapse in a second when it meets something it does not understand. One moment they were climbing over walls, arrogant, laughing, calling to one another like hunters who already taste the kill. The next, they were faltering, looking at each other with the unsettled eyes of men who feel a fear that has no clear source. It was not the fear of hidden defenders, because there were none. It was not the fear of a counterattack, because no horns sounded from Assisi's walls. It was a fear that rose from within, as if the air itself had become heavy, as if an invisible boundary had been drawn before them. Some accounts say a bright light poured from the sacred host, startling them like lightning in darkness. Some say a voice was heard, tender yet commanding, telling Clare that the convent would be protected. Others say nothing outwardly spectacular happened at all, only that the men were suddenly seized with terror and confusion. We do not need to choose which detail is most accurate in order to understand the heart of the miracle. The miracle was this: violence met faith, and faith did not move. The sisters watched the invaders step backward, then turn. Their ladders were dropped, their shouts dissolved into frantic orders. Hooves scraped stone as horses were pulled around. In the space of moments, the courtyard that had been crowded with threat was emptying. The men fled down the slope as if chased by something they could not name. San Damiano was spared. The sisters were spared. The city, which might have been opened to horror through this easy gate, was spared too, at least for that terrible night. Imagine the silence that followed. The convent would have heard the receding noise of armor, the fading voices of retreat, the night wind returning to its ordinary sound among olive leaves. The sisters, still pressed close behind Clare, began to breathe again. Some fell to their knees. Some clung to one another. A few may have laughed through tears in sheer disbelief. Clare herself did not collapse into triumph. She did not gaze after the soldiers with any savor of victory. She turned back toward the altar, still holding the Eucharist with reverence, and her face, witnesses say, held not pride but gratitude. It was as if she had only done what any daughter of the Church would do: bring danger to Christ because Christ is stronger. She asked that the sacrament be returned to its place, and she prayed again, quietly, thanking the Lord and entrusting Assisi into his mercy. If a voice had indeed come from the host, she accepted it not as a reward for bravery, but as a confirmation of what she already believed, that God protects those who belong to him. She then allowed herself to be carried back to her bed, exhausted not only by illness, but by the strain of the moment. Yet her exhaustion was peaceful. The sisters watched her withdraw into her cell like a candle returning to its lantern. The crisis had come, and her faith had held. News of what happened spread through Assisi quickly, because fear travels faster than calm, and marvel travels almost as fast as fear. People in the city had been preparing for siege. They expected to wake to smoke and mourning. Instead, they woke to a story that sounded impossible, even as they felt its truth in their preserved lives. A poor convent on the hillside, guarded by no soldiers, had turned back mercenaries through the prayer of one sick woman holding the Eucharist. The city responded with awe and a kind of grateful shame. Those who had once dismissed the poor ladies as reckless dreamers now saw that their hidden life was not useless. It was a fortress of another kind. In a world where walls can be climbed and gates broken, the strength that comes from God can still halt what armies cannot. Assisi began to honor Clare not merely as a pious woman, but as a protector. Yet Clare did not seek that honor, and in truth she did not even want to keep it. She knew that if she clung to a reputation for miracles, she would risk losing the deeper miracle of humility. So she returned to the ordinary rhythm of San Damiano as quickly as her body allowed. Still, something had changed. The sisters themselves had changed. They had watched faith in action at the edge of terror. They had seen their abbess, too weak to stand in a way that no strong man had stood. They had learned something that would not leave them, that the Eucharist is not only comfort but power, that prayer is not only private devotion but a shield over cities, that their poverty was not helplessness but availability to God. If any lingering doubt had existed among them about the realism of their vocation, it was burned away that night. To own nothing means you cannot defend yourself by worldly means, but it also means that when God defends you, you see His defense clearly. The sisters would carry that clarity into every future hardship. There is also a gentler, more mysterious side to this moment. Clare did not turn back an army because she had some personal spiritual force stored up like treasure. She turned back an army because she was empty enough for Christ to act through her. Her poverty was the open door. Her illness was the stripped-down altar. Her years of obedience to a hidden path had made her a vessel without cracks of self-reliance. In that sense, the miracle was less a sudden interruption of her life than the flowering of her whole life. The Eucharist in her hands was the same Eucharist she had adored in solitude, the same Christ she had chosen over wealth, the same Lord she had followed into weakness. When she lifted Him before the invaders, she was simply lifting what had always been her center. God did the rest. And so the Eucharist became her sword, and peace her victory. Yet Clare knew, even in the quiet after the soldiers' flight, that the deeper battle of her vocation was not finished. Armies can be turned back in a night. The slow pressure to compromise poverty, to soften love into safety, would return again. Her body would continue to fail. Her sisters would continue to need guidance. The Church would continue to wrestle with how to hold radical gospel lives within its wide embrace. Clare would meet all of that not with new drama, but with the same calm persistence she had shown before. She had defied an army with faith, yes, but she would also need to defy time itself with endurance. For now she slipped again into silence, because silence was where her strength lived, and where her next chapter was already forming. Saints return to silence, because silence is where love matures. The army left, but her true battle stayed. After the night when San Damiano was spared, the convent did not become a monument to triumph, and Clare did not allow it to become one even in the minds of her own sisters. There are souls who, after being touched by something extraordinary, begin to live for the echo of it, measuring God only by the moments that glitter. Clare was not such a soul. She had lived too long in hidden poverty to confuse grace with spectacle. If God had acted with power, it was because He was faithful, not because she was remarkable in herself. So when dawn spread over Assisi, and the city's gratitude began to rise toward the hillside, Clare quietly turned the sisters back toward their ordinary life. She knew that what would keep them faithful was not the memory of a miracle, but the daily practice of love in small things. The Eucharist had been their shield once. It would remain their bread every day. Prayer had held back violence in a night. It would have to hold back discouragement in 1,000 quieter nights. The city did not forget, however. People came to San Damiano with a new reverence. Some came with tears of gratitude, believing they owed their lives to the abbess who had stood at the gate with the Lord in her hands. Others came with curiosity, wanting to see the woman whom stories already called the protector of Assisi. A few came with the hidden wish that Clare might do another miracle for them, heal an illness, bless a household, solve a sorrow. Clare received them with kindness, but she did not cultivate their awe. She listened, prayed, and sent them away with peace rather than performance. When someone praised her courage, she redirected that praise toward Christ, sometimes with a simple word, sometimes with a silence that was more persuasive than speech. It was not false humility, it was clarity. She knew that a miracle is never owned by the one through whom it comes. It belongs to God and to the need He answers. To cling to it as a personal identity would be to betray the poverty she loved. So she let the event pass through her like a wind that bends a tree, but does not uproot it. She returned to her bed, to her pain, to the slow governance of a poor community, with no change in her inner posture except deeper gratitude. In fact, the return to ordinary suffering was itself a kind of new trial. After a moment of immense grace, the soul can feel a kind of emptiness when life resumes its humble routine. It can be tempted to disappointment, to a quiet inner complaint. Why was God so near then? And why does He feel farther now? Clare did not indulge that temptation. She had learned through years of illness that God's nearness is not measured by sensation. The same Lord who had driven the mercenaries away was now present in her cell, in her aching bones, in her inability to rise, in the sister's tired hands kneading bread. Holiness is not a ladder climbed by dramatic moments. It is a path walked by daily fidelity, whether it is noticed or not. Clare's heart stayed on that path. But the pressures from within the church did not soften simply because a miracle had occurred. If anything, they became more complicated. The story of San Damiano's deliverance spread beyond Assisi. It strengthened devotion to the Eucharist, and it lifted Clare's reputation higher. Yet reputations can be used in different ways. Some church officials began to see her fame as a means to tame her poverty, thinking that a respected saintly abbess could accept mitigations without scandal, thereby bringing the whole movement into safer order. They admired her holiness, and still they urged caution in practical matters. Offers of property, or at least of stable income, continued to arrive in various forms. Clare's response remained unchanged. She was courteous, grateful for concern, and immovable in vow. Her sisters watched this consistency and understood that their abbess's strength was not in her health, nor in a single night of courage, but in her refusal to let love be diluted by fear. This was a slower heroism, one without a visible enemy, and it demanded more patience than a battle does. Clare lived it quietly, day after day, like someone holding a candle steady against a draft. Her illness, too, deepened. The years now were not only marked by weakness, but by a kind of chronic endurance that could have crushed a less rooted soul. She spent long stretches unable to leave her bed, her body thin and often fevered. Yet she remained astonishingly attentive to the life of the convent. Sisters brought decisions to her. She listened, prayed, and answered. She asked to hear the gospel read aloud when she could not attend in the chapel. She made her cell a place of counsel rather than a place of retreat. Sometimes she sent little notes to sisters who were discouraged, reminding them of the beauty of their vocation. Sometimes she asked a sister to sit and speak with her in the evening, not to complain, but to share a quiet moment of human warmth. Clare was not a disembodied spirit. She loved laughter, small stories, the tender details of her sisters' lives. The more her body failed, the more her love seemed to widen. This is one of the paradoxes of saints. As their external world narrows, their internal world becomes vast. She also continued to write letters when she had strength, especially to women in other places who sought her counsel. Among them Agnes of Prague, a noble woman who wished to follow the same path of poverty. Clare encouraged her gently but firmly, explaining that true poverty is not merely lack, but love for Christ who became poor. She spoke of joy, of the dignity of dependence on God, of the beauty of belonging wholly to Him. These letters carried Clare's spirit beyond the walls of San Damiano. Without traveling, she was shaping hearts across Europe. It was another hidden fruit of her life. The world did not see her as a teacher in the way it sees scholars or bishops. Yet her words nourished souls because they rose from lived truth. Meanwhile, within San Damiano itself, the sisters were growing older. Some had entered young, and now carried their own aches and disappointments. Some had died. New ones came, drawn by the same gospel flame. Each generation needed to be formed again in the meaning of their radical poverty, because vows can become habits if they are not renewed in love. Clare renewed them not with grand speeches, but with steady example. She reminded the sisters that poverty was their bridegroom's gift, that to cling to it was to cling to him. She gently corrected any drift toward comfort. She encouraged the weak. She restrained the overzealous when zeal threatened to become pride. In doing so, she remained a true mother, guiding not toward an idealized severity, but toward a balanced holiness rooted in charity. There were moments, too, of quiet contemplation, where Clare allowed herself to gaze beyond immediate struggles. She looked back on her life and saw the thread of God running through it, the way He had led her from a noble house to a poor convent, from youthful strength to long illness, from hidden battles to visible miracle, and then back again to hiddenness. She did not interpret these movements as random. She saw a pedagogy of grace. God had been carving in her a heart that could hold two loves without conflict, love for the church as a whole, and love for the radical gospel within the church. She had learned to endure misunderstanding without bitterness, to remain peaceful without becoming passive, to be strong without becoming hard. This inner maturity was perhaps the most precious thing she had gained. The miracle at the gate was a sign for others. The miracle in her soul was the quiet shaping that made such a sign possible. Saints return to silence because silence is where love matures. Clare returned, and in returning she prepared for the final labor of her life, the labor that would require not only endurance, but a new boldness, to set her vocation into words that no authority could later dissolve, by writing a rule for her order with her own hands. The army had been turned away. The deeper work remained, and Clare's heart, though frail, was already leaning toward that last gift. If she could not travel, her words would. By the late years of Clare's life, the convent at San Damiano had become a kind of quiet crossroads. Pilgrims still came, officials still visited, sisters still arrived seeking the same radical path, and Clare herself lay for long stretches in her small cell, held there by illness as firmly as any wall. Yet the very stillness of her body sharpened the movement of her mind and spirit. She had learned, through decades of struggle, that if a gift is to survive beyond one lifetime, it must be secured not only in memory and example, but in a form that the Church can recognize and protect. The privilege of poverty she had carried like a shield was precious, but privileges can be reinterpreted or withdrawn by later hands. Francis's form of life had formed them, but it had not been written as a full rule for women, and men who governed from afar might someday say, "This is no longer adequate. This is too severe. This is not orderly." Clare sensed that her sisters, and the communities springing up in other towns, needed a rule that came from the original charism itself, not from cautious compromise. She sensed, too, that the one person who could write it with unquestioned fidelity was herself, because she had lived it from the beginning, and because her conscience had been tested in every fire. So while her strength faded outwardly, an inward determination gathered, quiet and bright, like a lamp being trimmed for its final night. The immediate pressure returned with a new force when Innocent IV, a pope both energetic and pragmatic, sought to settle the question of women's Franciscan communities in a unified and safer manner. He offered a revised rule in 1247 that allowed these sisters to hold property in common or to have stable revenues, believing that poverty without resources risked disorder. Many houses accepted this rule, grateful for security and relieved to be in unquestioned compliance. San Damiano, however, could not accept it without ceasing to be what it was. Clare received the proposal from her bed, listened to the reasoning behind it, and felt again that old ache of loving the Church while resisting her caution. She did not rebel publicly. She did not rally others against papal policy. She simply said, "For us, this is not our path." And because she knew that refusal alone would not protect the future, she began to do something no one expected from a cloistered, sick woman. She began to write her own rule. To write a rule is not merely to list regulations, it is to translate a spirit into words without letting it shrink. It is to name the heart of a vocation so clearly that later generations can return to it when they are tempted to drift. Clare approached this work the way she approached everything, through prayer. She asked the sisters to read to her the gospel passages that had shaped their life. She asked to hear again Francis's earliest counsels. She remembered the first nights of San Damiano, the taste of hunger, the joy of emptiness, the hard conversations with cardinals, the miracle at the gate. She wanted the rule to be neither harsher than grace, nor softer than truth. She wanted it to protect poverty without turning it into a cold legalism. She wanted it to preserve enclosure without choking charity. She wanted obedience to be real without becoming servile. In short, she wanted it to be a road to Christ, not a fence around fear. She wrote slowly, perhaps dictating at times when her hands were too weak, revising as prayer refined her. The sisters watched her with reverent attention. They knew that this was not simply administration. It was their mother leaving them a map of love. The rule she crafted was rooted in the same simple center that had guided her since youth. To follow the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, living in obedience, without anything of one's own, and in chastity. But unlike some rules written from theory, hers rose entirely from lived life. It described their prayer, the divine office, the humility of liturgical chanting even when voices were tired. It described their work not as a distraction from holiness, but as a form of it. It laid out fasting and simplicity with a maternal realism, encouraging zeal but allowing mercy for the sick. It insisted on enclosure as a protection of their contemplative calling, yet it did not make the sisters into stones. It emphasized mutual charity as the true soul of poverty, and it guarded their radical renunciation with careful clarity, forbidding the ownership of property, refusing endowments, requiring reliance on alms, not because alms were romantic, but because dependence on providence was their chosen way of imitating Christ. Clare knew that poverty without love becomes misery, and love without poverty risks becoming sentimental. Her rule braided them together in a way that kept both alive. There was also something quietly revolutionary in this act. Women in the Church had been holy for centuries, and some had guided communities through wisdom and sanctity. But a rule formally written by a woman and approved by the Pope was almost unheard of. Clare did not write to make a statement about women's authority. She wrote because necessity and vocation demanded it. Yet in doing so, she showed the Church something it needed to see, that the Spirit can entrust profound charisms to women not only to live, but to articulate for others. Her voice, gentle, faithful, unschooled in the universities, carried a weight that even learned prelates could not dismiss, because it was the weight of sanctity. If her body was confined, her vocation was not. Her pen became an extension of Francis's original fire, now shaped through a woman's contemplative fidelity. It was as though the hidden heart of San Damiano was being written into the Church's bloodstream. Still, approval was not guaranteed. Clare knew this, and the uncertainty pressed on her with a quiet urgency. She was nearing the end of her life. Fevers came more often. Weakness deepened. She could sense that if the rule was not secured soon, it might never be secured at all. So she prayed with a steadier intensity, not anxious, but keenly awake. When papal legates or bishops came, she presented the rule with humility, explaining its origins, its necessity, its faithfulness to the gospel and to Francis. She did not argue as a politician. She testified as a witness. Some were moved and saw the purity of her intention. Others hesitated, worried that such strict poverty would be too hard for future sisters. Clare listened to those fears and answered gently that difficulty is not the same as impossibility when grace is real. She had lived it for decades. Her sisters had lived it. It was hard, yes, but it was fruitful, and through the years she had learned what the world often forgets: that the Church is not preserved by lowering the gospel to human comfort, but by raising human hearts to the gospel through grace. Within the convent, the sisters sensed the gravity of this moment. They prayed for their abbess not merely as a dying mother, but as a founder laboring in her final hours. They copied drafts, rehearsed the heart of their vocation, and prepared themselves to receive whatever God would give. In those days, San Damiano felt both frail and immense, like a small boat carrying a treasure across dark water. Clare's rule was that treasure. She did not know whether she would live to see it approved. She only knew she must give it completely. And so, if she could not travel, her words would. They would travel into the future, into houses she would never see, into the hearts of sisters not yet born, into the Church's own memory. Clare, who had fled one night with only a palm in her hands, was now offering the Church a written path to the same poverty she had defended with her life. She was not trying to preserve a personal preference. She was trying to preserve a gift of the Spirit. A frail hand held the future of her sisters. What she had defended in suffering was now sealed in love. The final stretch of Clare's life unfolded with the quiet intensity of a candle, burning down to its last strong light. Her body by now was no longer merely weak. It was steadily failing, as if every year of fasting, vigil, and illness had gathered into a single narrowing corridor. She had lived nearly 4 decades at San Damiano, and the stone walls that once received her as a young runaway now felt almost like part of her own flesh. The sisters had grown used to seeing her in bed, to hearing her voice from a pillow rather than from the chapel, to carrying her when she insisted on being present for some feast or crisis. They loved her as a mother, but they also leaned on her like a pillar. If that pillar were to fall, they knew they would have to stand on the strength she had formed in them. Clare knew that too, and so her last months were not only a letting go, but a final act of giving, making sure that what God had planted through her would not be uprooted when she was gone. The rule she had written was ready, but approval still hovered like a question between earth and heaven. Clare's desire for papal confirmation did not come from ambition or mistrust. It came from responsibility. She had fought so long for the privilege of poverty, and she had seen how quickly policies can shift. She wanted to hand her daughters something firm enough to outlast changing winds, and she wanted to do it while she was still alive to testify to its meaning. In the last years of her life, she therefore pressed gently but persistently for recognition, even as her breath grew shorter and her fevers more frequent. The church was listening. Innocent IV, though cautious, was not blind to grace. He admired Clare's sanctity and had heard widely of the miracle at San Damiano. He also understood that a charism protected only by a living founder can be endangered when the founder dies. So in the summer of 1253, he did something of deep pastoral significance. He came to visit Clare himself, traveling to San Damiano as a pope to the bed of a sick nun. To picture that meeting is to sense the strange reversals of the gospel. The successor of Peter, clothed in authority that reached across Christendom, entered a poor hillside convent to sit beside a woman who owned nothing, commanded no armies, and could barely lift her head. Yet in that room, there were two loves at work, the love of order and the love of radical fidelity, meeting not as enemies, but as siblings, trying to understand each other. Innocent listened to Clare, and Clare, though weak, spoke clearly, not with the voice of a defeated woman bargaining for a concession, but with the voice of a bride guarding her promise. She asked for final approval of her rule, especially its insistence on absolute poverty. She spoke of Francis, of the gospel, of the life that had formed her sisters. She did not dramatize their hardship or threaten disobedience. She simply testified that this poverty was their path to Christ, and that to remove it would be to remove their heart. The Pope, seeing the clarity in her, was moved. He granted her what she had sought for so long. On August 9, 1253, a papal bull approved the rule of Saint Clare, confirming the privilege of poverty within it. The ink on that bull was not merely administrative. For Clare, it was the sealing of a lifelong vow. For her sisters, it was the securing of their future. For the Church, it was the recognition that this radical poverty was not a danger to order, but a gift within it. When the confirmation was placed in her hands, Clare's joy was not flamboyant. It was quiet gratitude, like a field drinking rain. She had waited decades for this, not because she needed to win an argument, but because she needed to protect a grace. Now the protection had come. She did not gloat over those who had urged compromise. She did not speak of herself as vindicated. She thanked God, and with that thanks, something in her could finally rest. She had carried the responsibility like a burden across years of illness and controversy. Now she could give the burden back to God and to the Church. Her daughters would not have to fight this battle alone. The rule would speak for her when her voice was silent. In a sense, after that day she had no unfinished work left on earth. Her body, however, was moving quickly toward the end. The sisters noticed that after the Pope's visit, her strength diminished more sharply. It was as if she had been holding herself upright for one final task, and now, with the task completed, she could let go. Fevers came and went, leaving her weaker each time. Her appetite faded. Her skin grew thinner over bone. Yet her face, witnesses say, carried a kind of peaceful brightness. She spoke often of heaven not with curiosity but with longing, as someone who had already begun to taste it in prayer. She asked to be brought the Eucharist whenever she could receive it, because the Lord she had lifted before an army was still the Lord she wanted as her final companion. She also asked to see her sisters, one by one, or gathered near her bed, and she blessed them in the simplest way, telling them to remain faithful to the poverty they had vowed, to love one another, to trust Christ above all. She did not need to say much. Her whole life had already spoken the message, and the rule now carried it in writing. Her few words were like the last strokes of a brush finishing a painting that was already complete. There were tender human moments in those days. She asked for Agnes, her sister, who had shared her path from the beginning. She asked for the sisters who had been with her through the first hard years at San Damiano. She smiled at the younger ones, who had entered long after Francis died, and who knew him only through Clare's memory. She listened to the Psalms from her bed and joined with a faint voice when she could. Even suffering, she remained gentle. She did not cling to life as if it were her possession. She treated it as a gift already offered back to God. The sisters, though grieving, were not surprised by her peace. They had seen that peace in her through every storm. Now they were seeing its final maturity. On August 11th, 1253, Clare died. The date is simple, but the moment behind it was layered with everything she had lived. She died poor, obedient, faithful, surrounded by women she had mothered into holiness, with a rule approved, a vow secured, and a heart at rest. There is a tradition that she died whispering praise, and that her face remained serene after her last breath, as if death had been not a theft, but a door. The sisters wept with the honest grief of daughters losing a mother. They also felt a strange steadiness beneath their grief, because Clare had already taught them how to stand in emptiness. She had left them not only her memory, but her path. The privilege of poverty was no longer a fragile parchment she alone defended. It was now the Church's own promise to them. Clare had received the blessing she had sought, and then she had let herself go into God. She slipped into eternity as quietly as she had lived. Yet even in that quiet, something immense had been accomplished. A noblewoman had become a poor sister. A sick abbess had become a defender of a city. A hidden contemplative had shaped the Church's understanding of poverty and women's charisms. And now, with her eyes closed on earth, her story was opening wider than ever, because the holiness of saints does not shrink after death. It expands. Death did not close her story. It opened it wider. Death did not close her story. It opened it wider. The day after Clare died, San Damiano was quieter, not because prayer had stopped, but because the sisters felt the first shock of living without the steady presence that had formed their life for 40 years. Her bed was empty, her voice no longer rose from the pillow, her thin hands no longer reached for theirs. Yet what she had given them did not vanish with her breath. It remained in their habits, in their psalms, in their refusal to own anything, in the rule now sealed by the Church. The sisters who had wept at her bedside now gathered around her body with a reverence mixed with grief, and in those first hours they already sensed what the wider Church would soon sense, that a saint had lived among them, not a saint of legend, but a saint of daily fidelity, whose holiness had been carved by hidden sacrifices and a love that outlasted fear. Word of her death spread through Assisi and beyond, and people came to see her, some out of devotion, some out of wonder, some drawn by gratitude because they believed their city had once been saved through her prayer. Her funeral was not a grand state occasion, but it drew the kind of attention that quiet holiness always gathers once the world realizes what it has been overlooking. The poor came because she had been their friend. Clergy came because they knew her purity had strengthened the Church. Citizens came because in her there was a simplicity that made the gospel feel close and real again. In the years that followed, Clare's reputation for sanctity only grew. Miracles were reported at her tomb, but even without miracles, her life itself was the strongest testimony. The Church moved quickly, by its standards, to recognize her officially. 2 years after her death, in 1255, Pope Alexander IV canonized her, naming her a saint for the whole Church, not because she had founded a successful institution, but because she had lived the gospel with an undivided heart. Her canonization did not change what she was. It simply told the world what God had already done in her. The poor ladies were now known as the Order of Saint Clare, and their houses spread through Italy and across Europe. Some communities lived the radical poverty as she had lived it. Others, under later pressures and local realities, accepted mitigations. Yet even where the practice varied, Clare's original vision remained a luminous reference point, a memory the Church could never entirely erase. Her rule continued to whisper to future generations that the gospel can be lived in its raw simplicity, even by women enclosed behind walls, even by bodies broken by illness, even in a world that thinks security is the first virtue. Her order became one of the most enduring fruits of the Franciscan movement, a hidden river of prayer flowing through centuries of wars, plagues, reforms, and revolutions. In countless towns, behind grilles and simple doors, poor Clares kept watch before the Eucharist, living the same poverty Clare had defended as if it were a bridal promise that still mattered. But Clare's legacy was never only institutional. She left the Church a spiritual image it still needs, the image of strength that does not resemble the world's strength. The world often admires power that conquers by force, by wealth, by public dominance. Clare showed another kind of power, the power of surrender. Her poverty was not weakness in disguise. It was weakness embraced openly and offered to God. In that offering, it became a place for divine strength to enter. The night she faced the mercenaries with the Eucharist was the visible symbol of that truth. But the truth itself had been lived long before, in the daily refusal to accept property, in the steady governance from a sickbed, in the patience that endured misunderstanding without turning bitter. She taught, without writing a treatise, that holiness is not reserved for those who can act in public arenas. It belongs fully to those who love Christ in hiddenness. The convent wall for Clare was not an escape from the world. It was a new way of serving the world, by becoming a pure space where prayer could rise without distraction. The city that once saw her as scandal learned to see her as guardian. And Assisi itself, through the memory of Clare and Francis together, became a kind of icon of evangelical poverty, a place where the Church could return when she needed to remember what she would look like if she trusted God more than wealth. Her devotion to the Eucharist also left a mark deeper than biography. Clare's love for the Blessed Sacrament was not sentimental. It was ardent and realistic. She believed the Eucharist was truly Jesus, not a metaphor, not a comfort object, but the living Lord who hides himself in humility so that the humble can meet him. That belief shaped her entire life. It shaped her courage when she lifted the host before soldiers. It shaped her endurance when illness pinned her to bed and the Eucharist became her daily strength. It shaped the spirituality of her order, making the poor Clares one of the Church's enduring witnesses to contemplative adoration. Even today, her story continues to strengthen faith in the Eucharist precisely because it is not abstract theology. It is a lived claim tested at the edge of terror and found true. Clare also left the Church an example of holy perseverance in the face of authority. She did not resist the Church because she despised her leaders. She resisted because she loved the gospel. Her life shows that fidelity is sometimes gentle firmness, that obedience and conscience are not enemies when both are rooted in Christ. She navigated a narrow path that many find hard even now, to be fully Catholic and fully radical at the same time, to love tradition without letting tradition become an excuse for comfort, to honor authority without surrendering the specific vow God has placed in one's heart. Her success in securing the privilege of poverty was not a personal victory. It was a victory for the Church's freedom to host radical charisms within her body. In that sense, Clare reshaped the Church not by storming her gates, but by kneeling at her heart until it opened. And perhaps this is what makes her story so consoling for those who listen in the quiet hours of night. Clare was not a saint because she was spared suffering. She was a saint because she loved through suffering. She was not a saint because she had control. She was a saint because she trusted when she did not. She was not a saint because she lived a dramatic public life. She was a saint because she consecrated an ordinary hidden life to God until it became extraordinary. In a world that still fears poverty, fears weakness, fears obscurity, Clare stands as a gentle contradiction. She tells the tired soul that you can be small and still be mighty in God, that you can be hidden and still change history, that you can be sick and still protect others, that you can own nothing and still be rich in grace. And if a quiet saint could change the church through faith alone, what hidden courage might God be forming in us, even now?